They called me the dumb daughter and gave everything to my genius twin. Now she's living in her car. My twin sister Olivia got the first college acceptance letter when we were 17, and my parents threw a party with champagne and a cake that cost more than my monthly allowance. Stanford, full scholarship, their golden girl headed to Silicon Valley. I got my letter from the state university 3 days later, partial financial aid, and my father barely looked up from his newspaper. He said something about how at least one of us would get a practical education, and my mother patted my shoulder like she was consoling me for losing a race I never knew I was running. We were identical twins. Same brown eyes, same dark hair, same face that people said was pretty when they looked at Olivia and plain when they looked at me. But our brains were supposedly different, hers brilliant and mine adequate, and that difference shaped every single day of our childhood. Olivia's bedroom was on the east side of the house with morning light and a desk my parents bought her when she got into the gifted program in 3rd grade. My room was in the back corner, smaller and darker, furnished with hand-me-downs from cousins. She had a Mac laptop at 14, while I shared the family desktop in the hallway. Her walls were covered with certificates from math competitions and science fairs, ribbons from academic Olympics, newspaper clippings about her winning the state spelling bee. My walls had posters of bands I liked and photos of friends, normal teenage stuff that my parents called clutter when they walked past my door. Every dinner conversation revolved around Olivia's latest achievement, her teachers calling her gifted, her test scores in the 99th percentile, the way she'd solved a problem that stumped her entire calculus class. I learned to stay quiet during meals, pushing food around my plate while they celebrated her brilliance. The comparison started early, probably before I was old enough to understand what it meant. Teachers would mention Olivia when they called on me in class, asking why I couldn't grasp concepts as quickly as my sister. Other parents at school events would congratulate my mother on Olivia's accomplishments and then look at me with this pitying expression, like I was a disappointing sequel to a best-selling novel. Kids at school called us the smart twin and the other one, and eventually I stopped correcting them. My guidance counselor suggested I consider vocational programs instead of university prep classes, even though my grades were solid B's and occasional A's. Not genius level, but perfectly respectable for someone who actually had to study instead of absorbing information through osmosis like Olivia seemed to do. But respectable wasn't enough in a family where one daughter was destined for greatness and the other was just taking up space. I chose nursing school after my freshman year of general education classes, partly because I genuinely wanted to help people, and partly because it was something Olivia would never do. She was headed for tech entrepreneurship, already talking about startups and venture capital and changing the world through innovation. Nursing was hands-on work, intimate and messy, dealing with bodies and emotions and the raw humanity that made Olivia uncomfortable. My parents acted like I'd announced I was dropping out to flip burgers. My father said nursing was fine for people who couldn't handle real academics, and my mother worried I'd waste my potential taking care of sick people instead of using my brain for something important. Olivia hugged me and said she was proud of me for finding my path, but I saw the relief in her eyes that I'd chosen something so completely different from her trajectory. We wouldn't be competing anymore because we weren't even playing the same game. Nursing school was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. 12-hour clinical rotations where I learned to insert catheters and change dressings and hold the hands of dying patients while their families fell apart in the hallway. Studying pharmacology and anatomy and disease processes until my eyes burned and my head pounded. Working night shifts at the hospital to pay tuition because my parents' financial support went primarily to Olivia's expenses at Stanford, her textbooks and conference fees and networking events that cost more than my entire semester. I slept 4 hours a night and lived on vending machine coffee and whatever free food I could scrounge from the hospital cafeteria. My classmates became my family, other exhausted students who understood the specific hell of learning to save lives while barely keeping our own together. We studied in groups and quizzed each other and held each other up when patients died, and we felt responsible even though we'd done everything right. Olivia graduated from Stanford with honors and job offers from 3 major tech companies. She chose the one with the best stock options and moved to San Francisco, sending photos of her apartment with bay windows and exposed brick. She made 6 figures her first year and posted about it on social media, talking about disrupting industries and changing paradigms and other Silicon Valley nonsense that made my teeth hurt. My parents flew out to visit her twice that year and came back glowing with pride, showing pictures to everyone at church and the country club. I graduated nursing school and got a job at County General Hospital making $48,000 a year, working in the emergency department because that's where they needed bodies and I needed experience. My parents came to my graduation but left early to catch a flight to Olivia's company launch party, and I tried not to feel hurt about spending the biggest day of my life alone at a chain restaurant celebrating with classmates who'd become better family than my blood relatives ever were. The emergency department taught me things they never covered in textbooks. How to assess a patient in 30 seconds and know if they were crashing. How to talk to someone high on meth who wanted to fight me while I tried to start an IV. How to hold pressure on a gunshot wound while calling for backup and praying the bleeding would stop. How to tell parents their child didn't make it and watch their world end in real time. I got good at it fast because I had to, because lives depended on my ability to think clearly under pressure and move efficiently through chaos. My hands stopped shaking when I did procedures. My voice stayed calm when I triaged mass casualty incidents and had to decide who got treated first. I made connections with patients in the brief, intense moments I had with them, learning their names and their stories and treating them like human beings instead of diagnoses. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't make me rich, but it mattered in ways that felt deeper than anything else I could imagine doing. 3 years into my nursing career, I met Dr. Julian Reeves at a trauma case that came in on a Friday night. Motorcycle versus truck, the rider coding as they wheeled him through the doors. Julian was the trauma surgeon on call, and I watched him work with this focused intensity that reminded me of artists I'd seen painting, completely absorbed in saving a life that everyone else had already written off. He cracked the chest right there in the trauma bay when the patient's heart stopped, reached inside and manually compressed the heart until it started beating again. 2 hours of surgery later, the guy was stable and headed to intensive care, and Julian found me restocking supplies in the trauma room. He asked my name and if I wanted to grab coffee when our shifts ended, and something about the way he looked at me, like I was interesting instead of disappointing, made me say yes, even though I was covered in blood and exhausted. We got married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse with a handful of friends as witnesses. My parents came but spent the reception talking about Olivia's promotion to senior engineer and her new Tesla. Julian didn't seem to notice or care that my family treated me like an afterthought. He came from a family of doctors and lawyers who valued achievement, but he valued different things: kindness and compassion, and the ability to stay human in a profession that often ground humanity out of people. He said I was the best nurse he'd ever worked with, that I saw things other people missed and connected with patients in ways that actually improved outcomes. He made me feel smart for the first time in my life. Not book smart like Olivia, but people smart, emotionally intelligent, capable in ways that mattered. We bought a small house near the hospital and filled it with secondhand furniture and plants I somehow managed to keep alive despite my work schedule. Olivia's startup went public when she was 29, and suddenly my sister was worth $40 million on paper. The news outlets called her a tech prodigy and the family genius who'd disrupted the cloud storage industry. My parents were insufferable, forwarding every article and interview to everyone they knew, throwing parties to celebrate her success. My father finally retired from his law practice and started going to conferences where Olivia spoke, introducing himself as her father to anyone who would listen. My mother joined charity boards and dropped Olivia's name constantly, riding her daughter's coattails into social circles that had previously excluded her. I sent Olivia a congratulations text, and she replied with a thank you and a promise to visit soon that I knew she'd never keep. We'd grown apart over the years, our lives diverging so completely that we barely spoke beyond birthday calls and holiday texts. She lived in a different world now, surrounded by other young tech millionaires and venture capitalists, and people who measured worth in stock portfolios and media coverage. My own life felt small by comparison, but it was mine and I'd built it myself. Julian and I both worked brutal schedules, but we carved out time for each other. Sunday morning breakfasts and late-night conversations and stolen moments between shifts. We talked about starting a family but kept putting it off because the timing never felt right, because we were both exhausted and barely keeping up with our current responsibilities. The emergency department promoted me to charge nurse, which meant more responsibility and slightly better pay, and the constant stress of managing other nurses while still doing direct patient care. I trained new graduates and mentored nursing students and became known as someone who could handle anything the department threw at her. It wasn't glamorous and nobody wrote articles about me, but patients remembered my name and came back asking for me, and that meant more than any stock options ever could. Then the text came on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the middle of a shift. Olivia asking if we could talk, saying it was important. I called her on my break and barely recognized her voice when she answered. She sounded thin and scared, nothing like the confident tech executive from her social media posts. She told me she'd made some mistakes, invested in the wrong things, trusted the wrong people. Her company's stock had crashed after fraud allegations surfaced about the CEO's financial practices. She'd lost everything in the collapse: her savings, her stock options, her reputation. Creditors were after her for personal guarantees she'd signed on company loans. She'd moved out of her apartment and was living in her car because she couldn't afford rent anymore. My brilliant genius sister was homeless. I stood in the break room holding my phone and processing information that didn't make sense. How did someone go from $40 million to living in their car in less than a year? Olivia explained through tears that most of her wealth had been tied up in company stock that became worthless overnight. She'd leveraged everything to invest more, believing the company would keep growing. She'd co-signed loans and put her personal assets at risk because the CEO convinced her it was smart business. When the fraud investigation started, creditors came after anyone associated with the company's financial dealings, and Olivia's name was all over documents she'd signed without reading carefully. She'd hired lawyers who took what money she had left and delivered nothing. She was 32 years old, sleeping in a 15-year-old Camry, and had nowhere else to turn. My first instinct was to help her immediately, to wire her money and find her a place to stay, and fix the problem like I'd been trained to fix problems. But something stopped me. Maybe self-preservation, or maybe the memory of every time she'd gotten the bigger room and the better computer and the celebration dinner while I got a shoulder pat. I asked her what our parents were doing to help, and she went quiet for too long. They'd offered her $5,000, she finally said, enough for a security deposit if she could find a landlord who'd rent to someone with destroyed credit and no job. They'd told her this was a learning experience, that she needed to rebuild from the ground up like they'd done when they were young. They'd also suggested she ask me for help since I'd always been more practical with money. The hypocrisy was stunning. The same parents who'd given her everything, and me scraps, were now treating her financial catastrophe as a character-building opportunity while expecting me to clean up the mess. I told Olivia I needed time to think and hung up before she could respond. Julian found me crying in the supply closet 20 minutes later, and I told him everything while he held me. He didn't tell me what to do, just listened and asked questions and helped me sort through the complicated mess of feelings. Did I want to help Olivia because I loved her, or because I felt obligated? What kind of help could I actually provide without destroying our own financial stability? How much of my anger was about her current situation versus decades of being treated as less than? He reminded me that we weren't wealthy, that we had a mortgage and student loans and lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Helping Olivia could mean sacrificing things we'd worked for, and I needed to be honest about what I was willing to give up and why. I called my parents that night and asked them directly what they expected from me. My father said Olivia needed family support, that siblings help each other in times of crisis. My mother added that I'd always been more grounded and practical, that maybe I could teach Olivia how to live on a budget and rebuild responsibly. I felt something snap inside me, years of accumulated resentment finally breaking through. I asked them why they'd only given her $5,000 when they'd spent easily 10 times that on her Stanford education and first apartment. My father said they were on a fixed income now that he'd retired, that they couldn't afford to bail her out completely. I pointed out they'd just returned from a Mediterranean cruise that cost at least $15,000 based on the photos they'd posted. The silence on the other end was deafening. My mother recovered first, saying the cruise was planned long ago and non-refundable. And besides, they deserved to enjoy their retirement after working hard their whole lives. I asked if they'd ever noticed they'd worked hard supporting one daughter while expecting the other to support herself. My father's voice went cold and sharp, the lawyer voice he used when he wanted to intimidate someone into backing down. He said I was being selfish and jealous, that I'd always resented Olivia's success, and now I was using her misfortune to settle old scores. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. I'd never resented Olivia's success, only the way our parents had treated her success as the only thing that mattered while dismissing everything I accomplished. I told them I'd talk to Olivia directly and make my own decision about what kind of help I could offer, and I hung up before they could guilt-trip me further. Olivia showed up at my house 3 days later, driving the Camry that had become her home. She looked terrible, her hair unwashed and tied back, her clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them, which she had. She'd lost weight and had dark circles under her eyes and moved with this defeated posture that broke my heart despite everything. Julian was at the hospital pulling a double shift, so it was just the two of us sitting in my small living room that suddenly felt luxurious compared to what she'd been living in. She apologized for showing up unannounced but said she didn't know where else to go. Our parents had made it clear their help would be minimal, and all her friends in San Francisco had disappeared when her money did. I'd been the only person who'd ever valued her for something other than her success, and she was sorry it took losing everything for her to realize that. I made her take a shower while I washed her clothes and made soup, basic caretaking that came naturally after years of nursing. When she emerged clean and wearing my spare bathrobe, she looked more like the sister I remembered from childhood, before the genius label had separated us into different categories of worth. We sat at my kitchen table and she told me everything, the whole sordid story of how she'd lost millions. The CEO had been cooking the books for years, inflating revenues and hiding debts, creating the illusion of a thriving company while actually running a sophisticated fraud scheme. Olivia had believed in the mission and the technology, had worked insane hours to build something meaningful, and never questioned the financial statements, because that wasn't her area of expertise. When federal investigators showed up, they'd frozen assets and started criminal proceedings, and everyone associated with the company became toxic overnight. She'd tried to find work in her field, but the scandal had destroyed her reputation. Other tech companies wouldn't touch her, afraid of legal liability or bad publicity. She'd applied for basic positions, entry-level work that would pay enough to survive, but her resume raised too many questions. Why would someone who'd been a senior engineer at a nearly unicorn startup want to work tech support or junior development? Employers assumed she was desperate or unqualified or would leave as soon as something better came along. She'd burned through her emergency fund in 3 months, then sold everything valuable, her furniture and jewelry and designer clothes, raising barely enough to cover legal fees that ultimately went nowhere. When she couldn't make rent, she'd moved into her car, parking in different places each night to avoid police and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. I listened without interrupting, watching my sister cry into soup at my kitchen table, and felt the competing urges of compassion and resentment fighting in my chest. Part of me wanted to wrap her in blankets and fix everything, channel the caretaker instinct that made me good at nursing into helping family. Another part remembered being called the dumb daughter, remembered watching her get everything while I got lectures about being more like her, remembered my graduation dinner cut short so they could attend her party. Julian and I could let her stay in our guest room temporarily, give her time to figure out next steps. But I knew from experience that temporary had a way of becoming permanent, and I needed to protect the life I'd built. I told her she could stay for 2 weeks while she figured out a plan, rent-free but with clear expectations. She'd contribute to household chores, apply for at least 5 jobs per day, and attend meetings with a financial counselor I'd help her find. After 2 weeks, we'd reassess based on her progress, and if she stayed longer, she'd need to contribute financially even if it was minimal. She agreed immediately, so grateful and relieved that I felt guilty for setting boundaries. But Julian had reminded me that helping people didn't mean sacrificing yourself, that boundaries were what made help sustainable instead of destructive. Olivia moved her few belongings into our guest room, mostly clothes in garbage bags and a laptop she'd somehow managed to keep, and I tried not to think about how her entire life now fit in a space smaller than her old walk-in closet. The first week was awkward as we all adjusted to having another person in the house. Olivia was quiet and helpful, doing dishes and laundry and cooking meals that were better than anything Julian and I usually managed. She applied for jobs obsessively, sending out dozens of applications daily and making follow-up calls. At night, I'd hear her crying through the thin walls, and I'd lie awake wondering if I was doing enough or too much or if there was any right answer to this situation. Julian was patient and kind with her, treating her with the same gentle professionalism he used with trauma patients, giving her space while being supportive. He mentioned during one of our rare private moments that Olivia seemed clinically depressed, that she might benefit from therapy if she could afford it. I added mental health care to the list of problems that needed solving. The financial counselor I found was a woman named Patricia who specialized in helping people rebuild after bankruptcy. She met with Olivia at our house, spreading documents across the dining room table and going through everything with brutal honesty. Olivia's credit was destroyed and would take years to rebuild. She owed approximately $300,000 to various creditors, mostly from personal guarantees on business loans. Bankruptcy was an option, but wouldn't discharge all the debt, and it would make future employment even harder in some fields. Patricia suggested Olivia consider changing careers entirely, finding work that didn't involve tech or finance, starting over in a field where her past wouldn't follow her. The suggestion made Olivia cry again, the reality of losing not just her money but her identity settling in. I sat in on the session and listened to Patricia explain options with the same matter-of-fact kindness I used when delivering bad news to patients. Sometimes the injury was too severe to fix completely, and the goal became managing damage and adapting to a new reality. Olivia would probably never work in tech again at the level she'd achieved. She'd never have that kind of money again. Her 20s and early 30s had been consumed by building something that collapsed, and now at 32, she was starting over with less than most people had at 22. What skills did Patricia have beyond coding and engineering? What had she enjoyed before tech consumed her entire identity? Olivia looked lost, unable to answer, and I realized my genius sister had built her entire self-concept around being smart and successful, and now didn't know who she was without those labels. Over the next several days, I watched Olivia struggle with depression that went beyond normal sadness. She'd sleep until noon if I didn't wake her, then sit at the kitchen table staring at her laptop without actually doing anything. She'd stopped applying for jobs with the same intensity, maybe because the constant rejection was wearing her down. She'd pick at food and say she wasn't hungry, clearly losing more weight. Julian pulled me aside one evening and said gently that Olivia needed professional help, that this was beyond what family support could address. He offered to connect her with a psychiatrist colleague who might do a consultation at reduced cost, and I felt grateful all over again that I'd married someone who saw suffering and wanted to help rather than judge. The psychiatrist confirmed moderate to severe depression and prescribed medication that we paid for because Olivia had no insurance. The prescription helped after a few weeks, lifting some of the fog that had been smothering her, but medication couldn't fix the fundamental problem of her destroyed life. She needed purpose and income and some path forward that wasn't just surviving in our guest room. I started researching alternative careers, things that used problem-solving and analytical skills without requiring a tech background or pristine reputation. Healthcare kept coming up, various positions from medical records to health informatics to patient navigation. I suggested she look into programs that could retrain her relatively quickly, certifications that might take months instead of years, using her intelligence in a new field. Olivia was resistant at first, clinging to the hope that some tech company would eventually hire her once the scandal faded. But Patricia had been blunt during their follow-up session, explaining that these kinds of scandals didn't fade in an industry that valued reputation above almost everything. Tech moved fast and forgot nothing, and Olivia's association with fraud would follow her forever in those circles. She needed to accept that chapter was closed and find something else, something where her past mattered less than her ability to learn and contribute. The conversation was brutal and necessary, and I watched my sister's face as she processed what letting go of her old identity meant. She'd been the genius tech prodigy, and now she was a 32-year-old woman with no career and crushing debt, starting over in a world that didn't care about her Stanford degree or her old titles. She found a medical coding certification program that promised job placement assistance after completion. 6 months of intensive training, learning to translate medical diagnoses and procedures into the standardized codes used for billing and insurance. It wasn't glamorous and the pay was modest compared to tech salaries, but it was stable work with decent benefits and opportunities for remote positions. Olivia enrolled using federal student aid, the irony of taking on more debt to escape debt not lost on either of us. She attacked the coursework with the same intensity she'd once applied to engineering, studying late into the night and finishing practice exercises until she got perfect scores. Her intelligence hadn't disappeared, just needed a new direction, and watching her engage with material again gave me hope. My parents called during Olivia's 3rd month with us, wanting updates and asking when she'd be back on her feet. I told them honestly that she was retraining for a new career and would need at least another 6 months before she'd be financially independent. My father sighed like I'd told him disappointing news and said he'd hoped Olivia would bounce back faster, that intelligence like hers shouldn't be wasted on medical billing. The casual dismissal of an entire profession that I worked adjacent to made my blood pressure spike. I asked him if he thought my work was a waste too, since I only took care of sick people instead of using my brain for something important. He backtracked awkwardly, saying that wasn't what he meant, but we both knew it was exactly what he meant. My mother changed the subject to their upcoming trip to wine country, and I hung up feeling exhausted by their inability to see worth beyond prestige and money. Julian and I argued for the first time in our marriage about how long Olivia could stay. Not a screaming fight, but a tense conversation where we both felt frustrated and unheard. He worried we were enabling her rather than helping her, that open-ended support might prevent her from becoming truly independent. I worried that pushing her out too soon would send her back to living in her car, undoing all the progress she'd made. We were both right and both wrong, trying to navigate a situation neither of us had experience with. We finally agreed on a firm timeline. Olivia could stay until she finished her certification program and secured employment, roughly 6 more months, but after that she needed to move out even if it meant living with roommates or in a modest apartment far from her old life. The boundary felt cruel and necessary in equal measure. I told Olivia about the timeline the next morning over coffee, and she took it better than I expected. She said she appreciated everything we'd done and didn't want to overstay or strain our marriage. She'd been looking at shared housing options and calculated she could afford a room in an apartment with roommates once she got a job, even with debt payments. She wanted to rebuild independently rather than depend on charity, and I heard echoes of our father's pride in her voice, the stubborn determination to prove herself. Part of me respected it, and part of me worried she wasn't being realistic about how hard the rebuild would be. Medical coding jobs started around $35,000 to $40,000 annually, a massive pay cut from her old salary, and with her debt load, she'd be living paycheck to paycheck for years. She passed her certification exam on the first try with a near-perfect score and had 3 job offers within 2 weeks. She chose a remote position with a hospital system in Texas, decent pay and benefits, and the flexibility to work from anywhere. She found a room in a house with 2 other women 30 minutes from us. Affordable and clean, if not particularly nice. Moving day felt surreal, watching her pack the same garbage bags she'd arrived with and load them into the Camry that still held all her worldly possessions. Julian and I helped her move in, meeting roommates who seemed pleasant enough, and setting up her small room with basics we'd bought as a moving gift. When we left, she hugged me tight and whispered thank you for saving her life, and I drove home crying for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. Months passed, and Olivia slowly built a new normal. She worked steady hours from her room, earning praise from supervisors for accuracy and speed. She made debt payments on a strict budget that left little room for extras. She adopted a cat from a shelter and posted photos that showed her actually smiling again. We had dinner every few weeks, and she'd talk about work challenges and roommate dynamics, and slowly seemed to be finding herself again as someone other than a failed tech prodigy. She wasn't the genius anymore, just a woman doing decent work and building a modest life, and she seemed more at peace than I'd ever seen her during her high-flying days. The medication helped, but I think the bigger change was letting go of the pressure to be extraordinary, and accepting that ordinary was enough. My parents visited for Christmas and barely recognized the sister sitting at our table. Olivia had gained back some weight and looked healthier, her hair cut in a practical style and her clothes from Target instead of designer brands. She talked about her coding work with genuine interest, explaining how she'd caught a major billing error that saved the hospital hundreds of thousands of dollars. My father listened politely but couldn't hide his disappointment that his genius daughter was finding satisfaction in what he clearly considered menial work. My mother kept asking when she'd go back to tech, when she'd use her real talents again, unable to accept that chapter was permanently closed. Olivia handled their questions with grace I hadn't expected, explaining patiently that she was happy now in ways she hadn't been before, that losing everything had actually freed her from expectations that were crushing her. The conversation shifted to me eventually, my parents asking about my work with that polite disinterest they'd always shown. I mentioned we were considering starting a family soon, that I'd been promoted to nurse manager, and Julian was being considered for chief of trauma surgery. My mother said that was nice and immediately turned back to Olivia, asking if she was dating anyone or if she'd reconnected with friends from Stanford. The casual dismissal was so familiar I barely felt it anymore, the sting worn smooth by decades of repetition. But Julian noticed, and later that night he asked how I'd tolerated being invisible in my own family for so long. I told him you got used to it eventually, learned to find validation elsewhere, built your worth on foundations other than parental approval. We got pregnant 3 months later, and I called my parents with the news expecting the usual lukewarm response. Instead, my mother burst into tears and said she couldn't believe she'd be a grandmother, that she'd been waiting years for one of us to have children. My father got on the phone and said he was proud of me for building a stable family life, that he'd always known I'd be good at the practical things. The comments were vintage them, somehow making my pregnancy about Olivia's failure to produce grandchildren first, and reducing my value to my ability to fulfill traditional roles. But I'd learned to take what I could get from them, accepting the scraps of approval while building my real life around people who valued me fully. Olivia was genuinely excited about becoming an aunt, showing up with baby gifts she could barely afford, and offering to babysit whenever we needed help. She'd been going to therapy in addition to medication, working through the trauma of losing everything and the deeper issues around identity and self-worth. Her therapist had helped her see how the genius label had been both a gift and a curse, opening doors while creating impossible pressure to constantly perform and achieve. Being smart had become her entire identity, and when circumstances stripped away the external markers of that intelligence, she'd lost her sense of self completely. Rebuilding from scratch had forced her to discover who she was beyond test scores and job titles, and she was finding she actually liked this version of herself better, even if it came with less money and prestige. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in April, after 18 hours of labor that left me exhausted and overwhelmed, and more in love than I'd known was possible. We named her Claire, and she was perfect in the way all new parents think their babies are perfect. My parents visited the hospital and held her with appropriate grandparent tears, taking dozens of photos to post on social media with captions about their first grandchild. Olivia came later that evening after they'd left, holding Claire with this tender carefulness and crying quietly. She told me I'd done something amazing, creating life and building a family, and she was sorry she'd never appreciated how hard I'd worked or how much I'd accomplished while she'd been busy being the genius. The apology felt genuine and decades overdue. Raising Claire while working as a nurse manager was brutal, the sleep deprivation and constant worry and never enough time for anything. Julian and I tag-teamed childcare around our work schedules, passing off a baby between shifts and surviving on coffee and adrenaline. Olivia helped when she could, coming over on weekends to watch Claire so we could sleep or occasionally go out like adults. She was surprisingly good with babies, patient and gentle and genuinely engaged, and I realized she'd never had the chance to be around children much during her old life. Everything had been about work and achievement and climbing ladders, leaving no room for normal human experiences like holding a baby and singing lullabies. She said one evening while rocking Claire to sleep that she was glad she'd lost everything, because otherwise she never would have slowed down enough to experience moments like this. The comment stuck with me over the following weeks. The idea that sometimes losing everything was necessary to find what actually mattered. Olivia had been on a trajectory that looked successful from the outside but was hollowing her out internally, the constant pressure to perform and achieve and be the genius leaving no space for actual life. The crash had been traumatic but also liberating, forcing her to rebuild around different values and discover that she didn't need millions of dollars or prestigious titles to have worth. She was learning what I'd known all along. That value came from how you treated people, and what you contributed and who you chose to be when nobody was watching. The genius label had been a trap disguised as a gift, and losing it had set her free. My parents never quite made that connection. They still talked about Olivia's tech days with nostalgia, mentioning her old salary and her articles in business magazines like she'd died instead of just changed careers. They'd ask periodically if she was looking for tech positions again, if she'd considered going back now that some time had passed. She'd explain patiently that she was happy where she was, that she made enough money and had work-life balance and wasn't interested in returning to the chaos of startup culture. They'd nod but clearly didn't understand, couldn't comprehend choosing satisfaction over prestige. Meanwhile, they'd ask me surface-level questions about Claire and my work, but never showed deep interest, never asked about my goals or challenges or what I was proud of. The pattern was so embedded it felt permanent, their inability to see me as anything other than the practical daughter who'd done okay despite limited intelligence. Claire's first birthday party was at our house, a simple gathering with family and close friends. My parents showed up with an enormous gift basket that probably cost more than everything else combined, making a show of their generosity while taking photos for social media. Olivia brought a handmade blanket she'd learned to crochet, each stitch representing hours of work on a hobby she'd taken up during her rebuild. My mother complimented the basket and barely glanced at the blanket, and I saw Olivia's face fall before she masked it. The same dynamic that had shaped our childhood was playing out with the next generation, value measured in money rather than effort or thoughtfulness. I made a point of telling Olivia that Claire would treasure the blanket, that handmade gifts meant more than anything you could buy, and I meant it. That evening after everyone left, Julian and I were cleaning up while Claire slept, and he mentioned he'd overheard part of a conversation between my parents. They'd been talking about how I'd turned out better than expected, how my career might not be prestigious, but at least I was stable and giving them grandchildren. My father had said something about low expectations leading to pleasant surprises, and my mother had agreed that I'd maximize my limited potential. Julian had been furious on my behalf, wanted to confront them about their dismissiveness, but I'd stopped him. There was no point fighting a battle I'd already accepted I couldn't win. They'd never see me as anything other than the dumb daughter who'd done okay, and I'd made peace with building my worth on other people's opinions. But something shifted in me after hearing that conversation secondhand. Maybe it was hormones or exhaustion, or finally hitting my limit after decades of casual dismissal. I called my parents the next day and told them we needed to talk, really talk, about how they'd treated me my entire life. My mother immediately got defensive, saying they'd always supported both daughters equally, and I was being overly sensitive. I laid out specific examples: the different bedrooms and computers and financial support, the celebration dinners for Olivia and shoulder pats for me, the way they'd always talked about her achievements while treating mine as expected. My father tried the lawyer tactic of invalidating my feelings, saying perception wasn't reality, and I was remembering things incorrectly. I told them I had a perfect memory of every slight and dismissal and casual cruelty, and I was done pretending it didn't hurt. The conversation went nowhere productive. They denied some things, minimized others, and ultimately fell back on the defense that they'd done their best as parents, and I needed to move on from childhood grievances. My mother cried and said she couldn't believe I was attacking them after they'd been nothing but supportive. My father said I was being ungrateful and dramatic, that plenty of people had it worse than getting compared to a smarter sibling. I hung up feeling frustrated but also strangely free, like I'd finally said things that needed saying even if they'd never truly hear them. Olivia called an hour later, said our parents had reached out to her complaining about my attitude, expecting her to mediate. She'd told them firmly that they'd treated me terribly, and she didn't blame me for being angry, and now they were upset with her too. We laughed about it in a way that felt healing, the two of us finally on the same side instead of competing for scraps of approval. Olivia said something that surprised me, that she'd always envied aspects of my life even during her successful years. I'd had real friendships and a stable marriage and work that felt meaningful, while she'd had money and prestige but felt empty and isolated. She'd been the genius everyone expected to change the world, and the pressure had been crushing even when she seemed to be winning. Being the dumb daughter had actually protected me from impossible expectations, let me build a life based on my own values instead of constantly performing for approval. The observation was both true and deeply sad, that neither of us had gotten what we needed from our parents, just different flavors of inadequacy. Things were tense with my parents for several months after that conversation. We still exchanged brief texts and saw each other at holidays, but the pretense of warmth was gone, replaced by polite distance. They doted on Claire during visits but maintained cool formality with me, like I was a difficult tenant they had to deal with rather than their daughter. Julian supported my decision to set boundaries, saying healthy relationships required honesty, and I'd been honest about my experience. Olivia stayed neutral but clearly sympathized with me, having spent the past few years learning how our parents' conditional love had damaged both of us in different ways. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when my mother had a minor stroke. My father called from the emergency room, his lawyer composure cracking as he explained what happened. She'd collapsed at the country club and been rushed to the hospital, and the doctor said she'd likely recover but needed monitoring. I drove to the hospital immediately, my nurse brain taking over, asking the right questions and understanding the medical jargon the doctors used. My father looked lost and scared, suddenly an old man instead of the intimidating figure from my childhood. I stayed with them through the night, coordinating with nurses and explaining what various tests meant and translating the information into terms he could understand. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he said quietly that he was glad I became a nurse, that he'd never understood how valuable that knowledge was until now. My mother recovered over the following weeks, and something softened in our relationship. Not a complete transformation, but a slight thaw, like winter edging toward spring. She thanked me for being there at the hospital, said she'd been scared and my presence had helped. We had a conversation one afternoon while she was still in rehab, more honest than we'd ever managed before. She admitted she'd always worried more about Olivia because Olivia seemed more fragile despite her intelligence, like someone who might shatter under pressure. I'd always seemed sturdy and capable, and she'd assumed I didn't need as much support. It was a flawed assumption based on misreading both daughters, but it was the closest to an apology I'd likely ever get. Olivia got promoted to a supervisory position in her coding department, managing a small team and earning recognition for her leadership. She'd been with the hospital system for 2 years now and had become valuable enough that they invested in her growth. She moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on her own, finally stable enough financially to afford independence. She was dating someone she'd met through a hiking group, a teacher named Liam who knew nothing about her tech past and valued her for who she was now. She brought him to family dinner one evening, and I watched him treat her with casual affection and respect that felt revolutionary compared to how I imagined her old tech boyfriend had operated. She looked happy in a grounded way that money had never achieved. My parents adjusted slowly to the reality that Olivia wasn't going back to tech, that their genius daughter had built a different kind of life. My father still occasionally made comments about wasted potential, but my mother had started defending Olivia's choices, saying stability and happiness mattered more than prestige. The stroke had changed her perspective slightly, made her think about legacy and what actually mattered. She'd started volunteering at a literacy program and talked about it with more enthusiasm than she'd ever shown for charity boards she'd joined to access Olivia's social circle. She asked about my work more often, actually listening to stories about patients and challenges instead of waiting politely for her turn to speak. Progress was incremental and incomplete, but it was progress. Claire turned 3, and we had another party at our house with the same core group. My parents brought another elaborate gift basket, but this time my mother also brought a handmade photo album she'd created, pictures of Claire from birth to now with little captions and memories. It wasn't expensive, but it represented time and effort and thoughtfulness, and I felt tears prick my eyes when I opened it. Olivia brought a wooden toy she and Liam had built together in his workshop, sanded smooth and painted in bright colors. My parents admired both gifts equally, a small moment that might have meant nothing to anyone else but felt monumental to me. My father even asked Liam about his work, genuine interest instead of condescending small talk, and I caught Olivia's eye across the room and saw she'd noticed too. That evening after everyone left, Julian and I were putting Claire to bed when she asked why Grandma and Grandpa didn't live closer. I told her they lived where they were happy, and we'd see them regularly, and she had an aunt who loved her very much and would always be around. Claire accepted this and fell asleep clutching the wooden toy from Olivia. Julian asked if I ever regretted the years of being undervalued, if I wished I'd been the genius daughter instead. I thought about it genuinely, considering what my life might have looked like with Olivia's gifts and pressures. I decided I wouldn't trade places, that being underestimated had let me build something real and solid while she'd been building something flashy that collapsed. I'd always been enough even when they couldn't see it, and that knowledge had carried me through. Olivia and Liam got engaged the following spring, a simple proposal during a hike that felt perfectly suited to who they were now. She asked me to be her maid of honor, and we went dress shopping on a Saturday while Julian watched Claire. Olivia tried on modest dresses from department stores, nothing like the designer clothes she used to wear, and looked more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. She chose a simple white dress that cost less than $300 and looked radiant in it. We got coffee afterward and talked about how strange life was, how the worst thing that ever happened to her had led to the best things. She'd lost everything but gained herself, and she wouldn't go back to her old life even if she could. The wedding was small and lovely, held in a botanical garden with close friends and family. My parents cried during the ceremony, my father's voice breaking when he gave a toast about both his daughters finding their paths in unexpected ways. He didn't apologize for the past, didn't acknowledge specifics, but there was something in his tone that felt like recognition, maybe that he'd been wrong about what success looked like. My mother hugged both Olivia and me afterward, telling us she was proud of the women we'd become, and I chose to believe she meant it, even if she'd never fully understand what those years of comparison had cost us. I got pregnant again a few months later, and this time my parents' reaction was immediate and wholehearted. My mother started buying baby clothes, and my father began researching college savings plans. They asked about my health and how I was managing work, and if they could help with Claire while I was handling pregnancy. The attention felt strange and overdue, like getting dessert before dinner, but I accepted it as growth, however incomplete. Olivia was thrilled about being an aunt again, already planning to teach her future niece or nephew all about coding and hiking and building things with your hands. My son was born the following March, a quick labor compared to Claire's marathon, and we named him Nathan. My parents visited the hospital with appropriate grandparent joy, but this time they also brought flowers for me specifically, acknowledging that I'd done something hard and remarkable. My father stayed while my mother went to see Claire at home with Julian, and we had a rare moment alone. He told me he'd been thinking about my nursing work, how I dedicated my life to helping people in their most vulnerable moments, And that took a kind of intelligence and strength he'd never fully appreciated. It wasn't a full apology for decades of dismissal, but it was acknowledgement, and I took it. Olivia came to visit after my parents left, holding Nathan with the same tender carefulness she'd shown with Claire. She said watching me build this family while managing my career made her realize how much I'd always been capable of, how the dumb daughter label had been their failure of perception rather than my failure of ability. I'd been smart in ways they couldn't measure with tests or titles, emotionally intelligent and resilient and wise about what mattered. She was sorry it took her losing everything to see it clearly, and she hoped I knew how much she admired the life I'd built when nobody was paying attention. We sat together in my hospital room, two sisters who'd been pitted against each other by labels and expectations, finally on equal ground. She'd been the genius who fell, and I'd been the disappointment who succeeded. But those stories were too simple for the complex reality of two lives lived under impossible parental standards. We'd both survived in our own ways, built meaning from different materials, and arrived at this moment where we could finally see each other clearly. She was my sister, not my competition, and I was hers, not her disappointment. The genius and the dumb daughter had both been fictions, masks that had hidden real people struggling to become themselves. Years later, when both my kids were in school and Olivia had been promoted twice more, and my parents had mellowed into their 70s, I'd look back on those early years and feel grateful for the unexpected shape of my life. Being underestimated had let me exceed expectations without the crushing pressure that had nearly destroyed Olivia. Building something small and steady had proven more durable than chasing greatness. My family thought they'd given everything to the genius and scraps to the failure, but really they'd freed me to become someone real while trapping her in performance. And when she'd finally escaped that trap and fallen to earth, I'd been there to catch her. Because that's what real sisters did. Not because of intelligence or success, but because of love that existed beneath all the labels and lived on after the genius label died. We'd both survived our parents' definitions and built our own, and that was enough.